All right. So we'll go ahead and do questions on 13, take our quiz, and then we'll finish 12 and do 13. So we have a little 12 left to do. Did everybody go home this weekend and make a model of neurons and play around with it? You thought about it a lot? Yes. Okay, so white matter versus gray matter. So white matter is axons. So like if you look at a part of the brain or the spinal cord and you just see white, that means there's only axons there. Gray matter is where the synapses are. So that means, what's at a synapse? What parts of the neuron? I heard somebody say dendrites. What else? Cell bodies. And then the axon terminals. So if you think of kind of an analogy like if you're like doing something with wires in a house, like trying to wire a light switch or something, the wire part, where it's not cut or attaching to anything, that's the white matter. And then when you get to the light switch and you like strip the wire, like attach them together, two different wires, that'd be like the gray matter, where the connections between two different wires are. And we'll talk more about white and gray matter today too. Mm-hmm.
What exactly did you want from that?
The superior and inferior ends.
Yeah.
What are some things people got for that one? Okay, so we've got medulla oblongata, which is part of the brainstem, up on top, and then the second lumbar vertebrae. Which means, is the second lumbar vertebrae, is that the bottom of is that your last vertebrae as you go down? No. It's not, right? So, the sacrum, the coccyx, they don't actually have a spinal cord in it, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's where I was confused. Real top and bottom or just like
Yeah, so talking about the actual like nervous, system part of it. Yeah. Yeah, so the main function of spinal nerves, first thing to know about them is that they're a mixed nerve, which means they have sensory neurons, sending information to the brain, but then they also have motor neurons sending signals away. So it's like one bundle of nerves with information going both ways. And so their job is to send and receive signals from the spinal cord to the rest of the body, like the peripheral part of the body. All right. Ready for a quiz? Yes?
Can you explain
Yeah, so I was actually going to tell y'all to just cross that one out. E. Posterior and anterior ramus. Just cross that one out. It's not important. There's plenty of other things in this chapter to focus on instead. All right. So go ahead and close all that up. Take our quiz. Can't keep your notes out today. I do it every time. It's funny, I had a student last semester who was just like spaced out during a quiz and just like open their book and start looking for the answer. Like, it's a class of like 4 people. Like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I don't know. I just got confused. I don't know what I'm thinking. It's just really funny. So they're like searching around. All right, let's go ahead and pass those on up if you're done. Thanks. Thank you. I guess I'll take those too. All right, so first one, what is a dermatome? Is it a brain region, an area of the skin sensed by one spinal nerve, type of neuron, or a layer of the meninges? It's an area of the skin. So one, you've got like spinal nerves coming out of each vertebrae, each side of it. And so then they would project to one spot on the skin, basically. What's a cluster of sensory neuron cell bodies? Motor tract, mixed nerve, posterior root ganglion, or anterior root? Maybe no one knows this one because it's not on the study guide. It's not on the study guide. Okay, that one will count. The answer is posterior root ganglion. But it's not on the study guide, I don't think. Yeah, so that one doesn't.
Do we get extra credit?
Sure, we'll make extra credit. Which means it doesn't count against you if you get it wrong. So, which type of tract sends information towards the brain? Sensory or motor or both? Sensory. Superior end of the spinal cord. It is the medulla oblongata, brainstem. The medulla oblongata or brainstem, those B. And what type of tract sends information away from the brain? Motor tract. Great. Blue marker. There it is. All right, so back to 12. I would say 12 is the hardest chapter of this unit. So really need to spend some time working on it. And if you didn't make your model this weekend of a neuron at home, which I bet nobody did, you should really do it this weekend. It'll really help, I promise. Take like half an hour, make yourself a little model, move things around, follow that assignment we did, and you'll understand like the whole chapter. It's a lot better use of your time than just reading about it, watching a movie or something. If you actually make a model and move things around, you will get it, I promise. Should I require it? Maybe I should make you record it and send me a YouTube link. Maybe I'll just pick 2 of you to require it from out of a hat. Just joking. All right, so let's do a quick review of neurons real fast before we get into the synapse. So at the dendrite, what's the normal membrane potential if it's not being activated? Negative, how much? All right, so minus 70, and then there's a certain kind of channel that gets opened. What were some examples of those at the dendrite? So it could be a ligand gated that opened. There are, the leak channels are there, definitely. But so we have a ligand gated, and there's another kind that could open and activate the neuron, depending on. So it could be mechanically gated. So either mechanical open or ligand. And what do they let into the cell? So usually they let in sodium in. What does that do to the membrane potential? So it makes it more positive. And if you get to a certain number, it's not 40. What makes sense? What makes more sense? If I'm trying to say like anything more positive, should I say greater? What makes more sense? Let's say that way. 55 or more positive than that. That causes something else to open. So that opens our voltage gated. And then what comes in? It's not potassium. It's sodium again. More sodium in. And then your membrane potential, goes up. So above 0. And then this just continues along down the axon. Sodium ions come in, and that makes the place next to it more positive than minus 55, which opens the next voltage channels, so on and so forth.
So for those to open, it has to be maybe 55 or more.
Yes, so our voltage-gated sodium channels, they're closed unless it's minus 55 or more potential. So it's kind of interesting because, for the first ones to open, you need those other channels, like the ligand-gated or the mechanical ones to open. But once some of these voltage-gated one opens, they make the ones next to them open, and the ones next to them open. So it's kind of like a reinforcing little loop there. So once you get the dendrite ones open, they're going to make all the ones open down the line, all through the axon. Questions about that stuff? Just make sure to review it. It's going to take some practice. All right, so what we want to know for this next part is how two neurons talk to each other. So obviously in the gray matter, you've got a dendrite of one neuron and an axon terminal of another. They meet up. You need to transfer information. So for example, sensory information from all those sensory receptors in your skin for pain, for touch. That neuron goes most of the time from there to the spinal cord. That's one neuron. But then the second neuron, goes from the spinal cord up to the brainstem or a part of the brain. So right there in the spinal cord, the first neuron needs to tell the second neuron, hey, your finger's touching something hot. So that's a synapse. So that's what we're working on, is how one neuron activates the next one in a sequence. There's two kinds of synapses. So we could have an electrical connection, or you can have chemical. For an electrical connection, like an electrical synapse, it's really easy. They're just, the two neurons are connected with gap junctions. So anybody remember what goes through gap junctions? That was a long time ago we talked about it. Do you think it's ions, proteins, or amino acids that go through? Here are a few whisperings of ions, which is right. So electrical, there's a gap junction. And what kind of ions do you think that would be? If one neuron's active, what kind of ions are coming inside of that neuron? Specifically, sodium. So the sodium ions from first neuron go to the second neuron. And if you have a lot of sodium ions, what opens up? So the voltage gated. So you don't even do this first step. You just let sodium ions into the next neuron. That makes it more positive than minus 55. Voltage gated one's open, and then that neuron sends the signal. So it's just like, it's the simpler one. You don't have to make a neurotransmitter. You don't have to do any of that business. Just take the signal that's coming down the neuron, the sodium ions, and they just go straight through to the next neuron. Open those voltage-gated channels. So one thing to point out that sometimes gets confused, I think, the synapse is always axon terminal of one neuron and dendrite of another. So the axon terminal, is that the sending end or the receiving end? It's the sending end. Axon terminal is the sending end, and then the next neuron that's there, that's the dendrite. So like axon terminal of neuron 1, dendrite of neuron 2. To add that. Right. So next up is our chemical synapse. So this is, mostly happening at the axon terminal. And we'll see a little picture of it in a moment. But basically, those action potential, or it's another way of saying just the sodium ions get to the end. voltage gated calcium channels open, calcium comes in. And that triggers the release of the neurotransmitter. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of signals changing from one type to another throughout the nervous system. So there's a little diagram of it that might make it a little clearer. So first, to orient you, this is our axon, this is our axon terminal, and then this is the second neuron, so like the dendrite of the second neuron over here. So here's our sodium ions coming in, coming down the axon, from the open channels. And when they get here, we've got voltage-gated calcium channels here and up there. And these little orange balls are calcium. They come in, and when calcium comes in, that signals for these neurotransmitters, what are these like little red diamonds, get released, and they go over to this cell, and the whole process starts again. Ligand-gated channels open, sodium comes in this second neuron. And then if those ligand-gated channels open, sodium comes in. If enough of it comes in, now the voltage-gated one's open. So everything that happened to that first neuron happens at the second one. Like the whole process of the action potential moving down the next axon and everything. So we've got sodium ions arriving, changing the voltage, opening the calcium channel sending out neurotransmitter going over to the next neuron. So quite a lot of steps there. Do y'all have any else? All right.
So are all the neurons attached by gap junctions?
It's a good question. They're not. So the neurons can either be gap junctions or chemical junctions. Like they could either be electrical synapses or chemical synapses.
Okay, so based on the type of synapse, it is the type of junction.
Right. Well, so gap junctions are electrical, and then for the chemical, that's the whole neurotransmitter calcium ions business. They are not physically attached. Just all over.
It just depends on, like, probably more chemical in your brain.
So there's basically chemical and electrical everywhere. There's no like,
Pertaining to the same function.
right.
That's
Do it.
So they can exist together in the same spot,
Um,
be one or the other, or can they just
well, between like one neuron and another, it's always one of those two, but it's not like you only have chemical in your brain and only have electrical everywhere else or something. It's just kind of all mixed around.
irrelevant as far as function?
Right.
Okay.
So we just want you to know how the two different ways neurons communicate to each other. So it's either directly with gap junctions or the neurotransmitter thing. So just to restate it one more time, after that neurotransmitter is released from the first one, it binds to the second neuron. Those receptors open and let ions in, and that'll trigger the action potential in the second one. Just like you started an action potential and you were working on it last time. Just let in sodium ions. Now you're on your way. All right, let's take a quick look at animation. Actually, maybe we want the intro. Maybe that'll be helpful.
one another or with effector cells via synapses.
All right.
In order to provide communication among the cells of the body, the billions of neurons in the nervous system must first communicate with one another or with effector cells via synapses. Synapses allow information to be filtered and integrated.
So you can see, blue, yellow, red, that's 3 different neurons. This is actually a reflex arc. So where this neuron meets this one, that's a synapse. And then where that neuron meets that one, that'd be a second synapse.
Synapses are either electrical or chemical. Electrical synapses are called gap junctions and have many ion channels called connexons connecting two adjacent cells. Electrical synapses allow quicker communication, more coordinated communication between cells, and two-way transmission.
So you just saw the little sodium ions going straight through between the cells there.
A physical separation between adjacent cells
So this
called
is
the synaptic cleft.
So this is our chemical synapse then. So you can see there's like a space between them. That's the synaptic cleft.
Is a characteristic of chemical synapses. Because action potentials cannot cross a synaptic cleft, this electrical signal is converted into a chemical signal using neurotransmitters to cross the cleft. Unlike electrical synapses that allow for two-way transmission of signals, communication at a chemical synapse is one way only, from presynaptic to postsynaptic membranes.
All right. Take it a little
A
farther.
series of events occur at chemical synapses in order to communicate with the adjacent cell. When the action potential arrives at the presynaptic membrane, its depolarization phase opens voltage-gated calcium channels, allowing the inflow of calcium ions from the extracellular fluid.
So positive charges come down, open those channels. You can see them moving in there.
Increased calcium in the cytosol triggers exocytosis of synaptic vesicles carrying neurotransmitter chemicals, releasing them into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters diffuse across the cleft and bind to receptors,
There they go.
often ligand-gated ion channels. Gated channels open, allowing ions to flow according to their concentration gradient. Sodium entering the cell makes the interior slightly more positive.
So yeah, comes over, binds to that second neuron receptor, and it's going to let those sodium ions in, which is good. All right, so the neuron sending the signal towards the synapse is called the pre or post synapse, synaptic neuron, or exodendritic or exoaxonic. So which neuron is sending the signal? All right, so y'all are exactly right. It is the presynaptic neuron. It sends a signal, the postsynaptic neuron receives it. All right, and just to confuse everything a little bit more, there's 2 kinds of neurotransmitters. There's an excitatory one, and there's an inhibitory one. And to just make it totally simple, find myself some space. So an excitatory neurotransmitter is going to activate the next neuron. So do you think it's going to go over to the neuron and tell it to let in positive ions or negative ions if it's trying to activate it? So let's in positive ions when it gets over to the next neuron. So what do you think the inhibitory one does? So what kind of ions is it going to let in? Right. So that's the difference. Negative ions. So for example, if your brain needs to tell a muscle to stop doing something, you could do that. We don't need to go into too much detail, though. Trying to keep 12 not too complicated. Just keeping the basics. Trying to keep the basics. So especially when, I would caution against like watching or Googling too much for this chapter because it tends to get really complicated really fast. So stick to the PowerPoint. The book's okay for this chapter. It's a little complicated too. But go back to the PowerPoint, go back to those group assignments. That's where it's really, I feel like I've simplified it somewhat. Although it's not simple, I realize. I know it's not simple. All right. Last question. Which of the following is true? All right, so I want you to chat with your group there and vote again. Which one is it? All right, so you all have some pretty convincing group mates there. And you are right, F is the answer. So really what this question is kind of saying is just saying the same thing a bunch of different ways, basically, right? So if you're increasing the positive charges inside a neuron, that's the same thing as making the membrane potential closer to threshold. What was threshold again? What number? Right. So if you start at minus 70, you let positive ions in, now you're minus 60, or maybe minus 50. So you're just getting closer or past the threshold. Yeah, that would be a good way to something to write down. So somewhere I'd probably write down minus 55 is membrane threshold. I think that helps understand everything a little better. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, since we kind of got all interrupted, you can take the physio exercise 3 off the lab practical. So, and then we'll try to find some time to finish it up sometime, because I think it was helpful, I think. I feel like people shaking heads.
So, what else did you want us to for the physio? Because we got 1 to 3 and almost 4, is that, because we stopped, that's where we were. And then you just wrote 1 to 3.
Yeah, so I'll just give it back and probably won't grade it, unless we find time to do the rest of it. And I'll have a practical study guide for you tomorrow. So you got your lab practical next Monday. It seems like it's kind of a short one, though. Doesn't it? I mean, we got muscles, little physio. It's not a whole lot's on there.
Chapter 10 is part of this. We didn't get tested on.
We did. I don't even think it's 11. It starts with 12. Yeah, we're just starting our unit. So it's 12 through 15 is our next test. So you got quite a while. I had someone in Bio 202. I said, "Are y'all ready for your test tomorrow?" She didn't know we had a test tomorrow. Yikes. Yeah, that's not good. Not good. And I would say for all the rest of these chapters for this unit, 13, especially 15, we keep coming back to how neurons work, talking about it a little more. So I think it does become a little clearer, because you start to see, like, as you zoom out a little more, bigger picture, and then you could kind of connect, like, the little picture. So I don't know, I've toyed with the idea of teaching the bigger picture first and then the little picture. I don't know. I still think the little picture is better first, but not entirely sure what's better. So 13, just talking about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And then I think next week is the brain, and then the nervous system. All right, so what does the spinal cord do? One of the things that people probably don't know that the spinal cord does is actually process your reflexes. So a lot of those reflexes you have, the brain's never involved in it. It's like if you stab your finger and pull back, or your muscles are told to relax if they start getting too contracted, putting on too much pressure. Why do you think that's a good thing for the spinal cord to decide on that reflex instead of the brain? Why not? But I mean, yeah, but why? Why would you be more likely to get injured? Because it takes longer, right? If you have to send your signal, from here to here, all the way up to the brain, back down here, back to there. It doesn't take like a minute or two, but it does take longer. And if you've got yourself on touching something hot, you want to get away as fast as possible. So that's the spinal cord's job. Which is crazy, because think about, it still takes some time, right? If you touch something hot, you still get burned, don't you? And I feel like if that happens to me, I just feel like my finger's on there forever, doesn't it? Even though it's probably like hardly any. It's like you feel the burning, and you're like, why is it still on there? I don't know. It's kind of a strange, because, I don't know. No, because that pain signal does go all the way to your brain. So it almost seems like, by the time you feel the pain, maybe it's already off, right? Does that seem about right? I'm trying to think of how fast that actually happens. What do y'all think? Or is it about the same time? Well, I know what we can do for lab next week then. Yeah, bring curling irons, maybe bring like some really sharp little, some sharp things to poke people with. All right, I'll work on that.
I'll cut myself or something, I'll kind of not know it, and then not even feeling the pain, but then you fail and see it, and then all of a sudden it hurts. Shit, why am I bleeding?
Yeah. It's interesting. So we'll talk more about number 2, and then 3 is probably the main one you think of. Just getting signals from the brain down to the muscles, or taking signals from out, all throughout the body and sending it to the brain. So it's functions and, it does make decisions, but then it also just transmits information both directions. All right. Some of you may have, did anyone look at the spinal cord of the rat when they were butchering it? So if you did, you'd see the vertebrae, and then inside is the spinal cord there. And you could see, like when we did the vertebrae, we said one of its main jobs is to protect the spinal cord. So there is bone all the way around. And then inside of that is that cerebrospinal fluid. Has anyone had a spinal tap before? Or anything? Twice. So like if they think you might have meningitis or some other conditions, they can just stick a nice little needle in there, collect some fluid. Did it hurt?
I don't know, it's right there.
Oh, that's probably why, because it does hurt. They do stick a needle, through the bone there to get some fluid. All right, and then so we've got 3 layers of protection then. We've got to protect our spinal cord. And then starting on the outside, you've got the bone. And then there's some connective tissue, which are the meninges, which we'll talk about. And then inside of that is a fluid. And we'll talk about the fluid a little bit too, I think. Or maybe not. So why do you think we're listing fluid as a protection layer? It absorbs shock really well, definitely. Because obviously your bone absorbs some shock, but what's better at absorbing shock is the fluid, because it can just squeeze it around. So that's why we've got fluid there. It's really protective from trauma and everything. And then, of course, the meninges are there, keep the fluid in, and then also, prevent foreign things from getting inside, like bacteria or toxins, anything like that. Because your neurons, they're pretty delicate, right? Can't regenerate them. If they're dead forever. So the body tries really hard to keep the spinal cord and the brain protected from as many possible things. And our meninges, made of 3 layers. They are membranes. So do you remember what kind of tissues make up membranes? Connective and epithelial, right? So 3 layers of those, moving from outside the spinal area to inside. It goes dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. Don't really need to know any details about them, just know them in order. Know that they're the 3 layers of the meninges. Just keep things out, keep the fluid in. So if you slice a spinal cord, and look at it, what kind of shape does that look like to you? It's a psychology test. Most people would say butterfly. What? Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure why this is brown and white. If it was a fresh spinal cord, it'd be white and gray. So when we dissect the brain, though, you'll actually be able to see like the white and the gray parts when you cut it in half. Kind of fun. I got a bucket of sheep brains back there for us. I don't know if is it next week? It's soon. Yeah, it's on the schedule for the 18th. Their brains are so much smaller than you'd think, because they're, all those like cow, sheep, goat. It's like this big. It's like this little tiny thing. So, anyway, so if you slice it, the gray matter is in the butterfly area, and it's kind of in the middle, and then in the white matter out here is where the axons are. So where do you think the synapses are? Are they in the gray or the white? They're in the gray matter. Because remember, we said gray matter is where the dendrites, axon terminals. So the gray matter is where neurons meet and tell each other what to do, connect together. And everything out here in the white matter is just the axons going from one place to another. So like maybe this is an axon going from the brain to in here, or from the brain out to somewhere else. So gray matter, cell bodies, dendrites, etc. The gray matter is where you kind of integrate to do reflexes. So if you're, stab yourself with something, that information comes into the spinal cord, into the gray area, or the gray matter, tells some other neurons there, and that last neuron comes out and tells you to move away from it. And we've got some slides about spinal reflexes later. But the gray matter is where it decides to pull away, and then it sends a signal out. White matter, that's where the axons only are. So conducting neural impulses to and from the brain. Any questions so far? All right. Just wanted to show you one example of a sensory conduction pathway. Don't need to know everything on here. It's just as an example. So what kind of sensory neuron do you want to do? What kind of sense? Okay. How about something that's not in your head area? Because that's a little confusing. We're going to talk about that later. Okay, so like, let's say you're just talking about touch on your fingers. So whenever your fingers touch something, that's going to activate the dendrite of the first neuron, the primary neuron. It's going to send a signal through this axon, past the cell body, into the white matter. See, we're in the white matter there. All the way up to the brainstem, to the medulla. That's one neuron. And right there, is that going to be the axon terminal or the dendrite of the first neuron? It's axon terminal, right? Because it's the sending end of the first neuron. And then next to it is the dendrite of the second neuron. So that's one synapse. So this is our second neuron here. Second neuron, there's its dendrite. Maybe that's a chemical synapse. Activates this one. And then that axon gets activated. So that signal's traveling all the way through, till it gets to the thalamus, which is another part of the brain. Then, is that an axon terminal or dendrite of the second neuron? Axon terminal of the second one, dendrite of the third one. So send that signal from the second neuron to the third. Then its axon goes all the way to part of the cerebellum, another part of the brain, and delivers the info. Like telling, so this part of the brain is like your conscious part. So like this is where it would send the signal to there, and then you know that you're touching something. The end of that third neuron. Just to give you an example of how those signals would travel. So just remember, it always axons in an axon terminals, and then they send the signal from an axon terminal to a dendrite. It's always that direction. Always, always. And an interesting thing about the spinal cord is axons with similar functions are grouped together as they go up and down the spinal cord. And those group of axons that have a similar function are called tracks. And so we've got all different ones. They're color-coded here. So we've got sensory in blue and motor in red. And so, for example, we're going to talk about which ones? Spinothalamic and posterior, I believe. You'll see what kind of information is traveling through there. But maybe, right here, this little red tract, maybe that's all the info for smooth muscle or something. And then this one over here, maybe that's all the info for voluntary skeletal muscle, for you telling your muscles to contract. It's all going through there. So this is why you can get a spinal cord injury and lose sensory info for part of your body. Or you can't move this, you lose skeletal muscle control in this leg or something. That's because that part was injured. It doesn't always have to be complete, bisection of the spinal cord. It could just be one of those tracks got damaged or something. All right, what's a tract? All right, so maybe chat with your group there. Got A, E, and F as choices. Final votes? Pretty blurry here. 4, 6, 9. All right. So we got 70% for E, which is the right answer. So it is a cluster of axons. And if it's only axons, it's white matter, right? This will be both of them. All right, so we could certainly talk about all the tracks, but instead I just picked out 2 to talk about. because there's enough. So these are two different sensory tracts, which means they're axons, and which direction is information moving then? Is it going up or is it going down? So if it's a sensory tract, information going up to the brain or down. That's what I got. They both carry information from sensory receptors, but the type of neurons that send their axons through there are different. So the spinothalamic, it has axons that are sending information about pain, temperature, tickling. Did you know you have a tickling neuron? It's kind of crazy. Crude touch and deep pressure. And then the posterior tract is different. It's detailed touch, light pressure, vibration, and this word proprioception. That's basically information about where your limbs are. Because, right, if you close your eyes and do something, do you know where your hands and feet are? Did someone say no? You may have a posterior tract problem. Open your eyes, it's there. That would be interesting. So that's proprioception. It's crazy. So spinal thalamic and posterior, just to point out where they are. They're spinothalamic, and then posterior back there. Doesn't really matter exactly, but you can kind of see that they're in different spots. Let's see. Yeah, let's do this little Venn diagram business about those two. There you go. There you go. So we're just going to do question number 1, I think. I'll take all those extras. I passed you way too many. Thank you. So feel free to work together there. Make sure you got the same stuff with your group. It's like you can just tell that something's touching you. But
Would it be like slapping? Kind of not like that.
so I think
Because a crude
I remember some of it. So one of them, like you, detailed touch is like if you've got two things touch you, you can tell how far apart they are. But with crude touch, it would just be like something's touching you
It's kind of like that.
in two places, but you can't tell like where.
Like that.
I don't know. It's a little hard to describe because it's so like backwards to try to imagine certain parts but not working.
Huh.
But the best description I've had is like if two things are touching your finger, you could tell how far apart they are. Which you can imagine if you're trying to use your fingers for any sort of, you know, complicated task. If you don't have detailed touch, there's no way you could do that.
Like typing or something.
Like typing or using like a tool. You know, think about like apes kind of or something. You know, they have detailed touch, which is why they could do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So based on what you just did, let's say someone has some kind of spinal trauma, and they can feel light pressure, but they can't feel any coldness or warmth. Which tract is damaged? All right, so almost everybody said spinothalamic. So they can't feel coolness and warmth, which is going through the spinothalamic tract. So it must be the one that's damaged. So all right. All right, let's just not worry about this stuff for now and go to make sure we get to the reflexes for today. I think that's the most important for now. All right. So reflexes. The first thing to know is, are reflexes voluntary? They're not. They're automatic, so they're involuntary. So there's some different kind of reasons we have reflexes. The first one you imagine is probably the most obvious, keep you away from something painful or damaging. But then there's also reflexes that maintain homeostasis within your body. So like the pH of your stomach or how fast food's being digested in your intestines. Those are types of reflexes too. But we're mostly going to talk about the ones you're familiar with. So go back to the animation in a second, but I wanted to show you the 5 components of a reflex arc. All reflexes have this. So the first one, which is kind of blah. The first part of a reflex arc is the sensory receptor. So that would be like the dendrite of a sensory neuron. So for example, it's sensing that nice nail that's going into the skin there. Looks terrible, doesn't it? So that's first. Second is the neuron has to send the signal. So second would be the axon of the sensory neuron. Third is what's called the integrating center. So this is the neuron that decides whether it's enough pain to start the reflex. This looks like a lot of pain, so it's going to send a strong signal, and probably it's going to be multiple neurons, right? You've got lots of neurons in your fingers that sense pain, so it's going to be 10 neurons coming into this one integrating center. So that neuron decides we should respond. So then the fourth part is the axon of the motor neuron, and then the fifth part is the effector. So in this case, it would be the muscle that pulls your hand away. It tells that muscle to contract. So those are your five stages there, 5 steps. Let's take a look at it said a different way.
Reflexes are the rapid, predictable, and automatic responses of skeletal muscle to changes in stimuli. All reflex arcs include 5 functional components: sensory receptor, sensory neuron, integrating center, motor neuron, and effector. Other characteristics, or combination of characteristics, differentiate types of reflex arcs from one another. The simplest of reflex arcs have a single synapse between the sensory neuron and motor neuron. These reflex arcs are referred to as monosynaptic. When an integrating center has one or more association neurons relaying messages to other association or motor neurons, the reflex arc is polysynaptic. An ipsilateral reflex is one that has the sensory neuron entering and the motor neuron exiting on the same side of the integrating.
All right, that doesn't matter. Let's take a look at one example.
The stretch reflex is a response to the stretching of muscles. It is monosynaptic and ipsilateral. Stretching stimulates receptors in the muscle spindle of the agonist stretched muscle.
All right, so for a stretch reflex, basically this is your muscle stretching, activates it. Let's start there. Take a look at.
Generated by the receptors and propagate along the axon of the sensory neuron. In the spinal cord, the sensory impulses directly excite a single motor neuron leading to the agonist muscle. The sensory impulses also stimulate an inhibitory association neuron in the spinal cord. In turn, this interneuron inhibits the motor neuron leading to the antagonist opposing muscle. Reciprocal innervation results when the stretching agonist muscle contracts and the opposing antagonist muscle relaxes. In addition, conscious proprioception information is relayed to the cerebrum.
All right, so an easy example for this one. but I need everybody to stand up. We're going to do some stretching. Got to do some exercise. It's going to wake up. All right, so everybody face that way so that I can say right and left and not get backwards. All right, so lean to your left. Just lean over. Did anybody fall over? Hopefully not. That's because of your stretch reflex. So if you had to guess which of your abs, your right or your left side, just contracted to hold you up. Your right, and what do you think happened to your left? They relaxed, right? That's your stretch reflex. Did you have to think about contracting those muscles on the right side? You didn't. It was automatic. It kept you from falling over. Now this is happening all the time when you're walking around because you're constantly like maybe leaning a little one way or the other. So especially like in the core all over, that stretch tells you that you're leaning one way too far, and it'll contract to kind of hold you there. Tell the other one to relax. Also, do you think there's a chance you could stretch a muscle too far and damage it? Definitely could. So this protects you from that as well. So like as it's stretching, it's going to send information to the spinal cord. The spinal cord's going to tell that muscle, you're stretching, you better contract before you stretch too much. Right. So which of these is not part of a reflex arc? All right, you are right. C is not part of it. Receptor, effector, motor nerve there, motor neuron. All right, what about another question? Which of these is not true of a reflex arc? And this question is applying to this one that we're looking at. So it's applying to this specific example. Maybe chat with your group there for a moment. Let me put it back to here for a second for you to glance over. All right, so I'm going to tell you the answer in the interest of time. The answer is B for this example. Because axon terminal of a sensory neuron activates the dendrite of a motor neuron. What was missing? The interneuron. Right? This axon terminal activated the dendrite of the interneuron. It was between those two. Of course, that's not always true, right? All right, last one. Tendon reflex. This controls muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation. So imagine, especially like, lifting weights, doing sports, some kind of physical activity. Do you think you can contract a muscle too hard and damage the tendon? Definitely can. Or make make a movement that's causing the tendon to start to become damaged. So there's sensors in the tendon. If they're getting too much stretch, they tell the muscle to relax. Makes sense, right? If that muscle's causing the tendon too much force, tell that muscle to relax, and you should relieve that tension. And then, of course, also, you tell the antagonist muscle to contract at the same time to protect that tendon. So that's your tendon reflex. All right. Happy Tuesday.